The Go-Giver, a little story about a powerful business idea by Bob Burg and John David Mann. The Law of Value. Just before noon that Monday, Joe arrived at the Great Stone Mansion eager to see what lay in store. All he knew was that he would be meeting with Pender and a friend of his, a real estate magnate who had agreed to talk with Joe about the first law of the stratospheric success. Joe still wondered about this whole giving business and whether or not this trade secret contained anything that would really work for him. But it's sure working for Pender, he mused as he drove up the broad, tree-lined drive. And it wasn't just the man's resume and magnificent property. The guy radiates success, he thought. It's not just money. It's something far more powerful than money. He had thought about nothing else all weekend and still couldn't quite identify with what that something was. Pender stood waiting for him as he rounded the circular drive and pulled up to the stone steps. Before Joe could cut the engine, Pender opened the passenger door and hopped in. "Okay, if we take your car?" "Don't want to be late for our meeting." Joe felt a stab of disappointment. He wasn't going to get any of Rachel's famous coffee after all. "Here," said Pender as he buckled himself into his seat and handed over a giant mug of steaming hot coffee. "You can enjoy this along the way." 20 minutes later, they arrived downtown and parked at Alfredo's Italian-American Cafe. Obviously, much more than a cafe, the full-service restaurant was jammed with a line forming at the door. On their way into the building, someone pushed gruffly past them, complaining about how crowded it was, and bumped into Pender. Much to Joe's surprise, Pender simply smiled at him. The moment they were inside the door, the mayor came over and escorted the two of them to a corner table. Of course, thought Joe, Pender must be a VIP here. "Thank you, Saul," said Pender. Saul bowed to Pender and winked at Joe. It struck Joe that Pender was exceedingly gracious to everyone they encountered, and as they took their seats, Joe asked Pender about that. "It never hurts to be kind to people," Pender replied. "Once when I was a young man, I was walking to a young lady's home to meet her for our very first date. I was nervous. As I turned onto a street, an older man walked right into me, banging his head into mine and trumping on my foot. He was embarrassed that he hadn't been watching where he was going and mortified that he might have injured me. 'No harm done,' I assured him. 'I've been told I have a hard head. I hope you didn't hurt yourself.' He laughed with the surprise. I wished him a wonderful day and hurried on to meet my young lady friend. About 15 minutes after I'd arrived at the girl's home, I heard the front door open. 'Daddy,' she called out, 'I want you to meet my date.'" Pender stopped and glanced at Joe's as if he was expecting him to finish the story. Joe did. "And let me guess, it was the man who smacked into you?" "It was," agreed Pender. "Back from a quick trip to the store." He complimented his daughter on her good judgment and told her I was a thoughtful, polite young man. "So you could say your relationship got off on the right foot," observed Joe. Pender laughed. "Indeed it did. Stayed that way, too. That beautiful young lady has been my wife for nearly 50 years. "Ernesto," he called out to one of the cooks who was headed their way. "Buen griner cara?" Pender exclaimed. The portly fellow beamed and hunkered down with them at their table. "You going to introduce me to your friend?" Ernesto's voice bore traces of a crisp northern Italian accent. "Ernesto, this is Joe. Joe, Ernesto." A young waiter approached with a pair of menus, but before Joe or Pender could say a word, Ernesto turned to the young man and fired off a soft stream of Italian phrases. The waiter whooshed silently away again. Ernesto said, "Pender, tell my young friend how you got started here." Ernesto looked at Joe and said, "Hot dogs." Joe blinked. "Hot dogs?" "I came here," Ernesto went on, must be more than 20 years ago. Now, a foolish young man. I had just enough money saved to buy a hot dog cart and the license to run it. Actually, come to think of it, the license cost me more than the cart." Pender chuckled, and Joe had the distinct sense that his host had heard this story many times before. "It was hard at first," Ernesto was saying, "but I had some loyal customers and word got around. After a few years, my little cart got written up in the city's annual Best of Guide." The chef paused to glance back toward the grill. "Wow, really?" said Joe. "Best hot dog stand in the city. That's great." Pender smiled and gently corrected him. Best outdoor dining experience in the city. Ernesto held up both hands modestly and shrugged. They were kind to me. But, Joe stammered, how did you do that? I mean, no offense, but how does a hot dog stand manage to outrank the swanky sidewalk cafes in this neighborhood? Ernesto gave another theatrical shrug, his eyebrows and shoulders moving together like a marionette, saying, who knows? He winked at Pender. Lucky. He glanced back at the grill again, and he stood up and strode away. Quite a character, Joe noted aloud as they watched Ernesto disappear through a door into the kitchen. Pender nodded. Indeed he is. Actually, Ernesto is the head chef here. Really? Said Joe. Really, Pender replied. In fact, he owns the place. Really? Joe was intrigued. Their waiter placed their food before them, and Pender thanked him. He took his first bite of eggplant parmigiana, closed his eyes, and groaned with pleasure. The man is an artist. It's delicious, Joe agreed. As he dove into the magnificent meal, he thought of how Susan would have loved this place. The two men ate in silence for nearly a minute before Pender spoke again. In fact, he owns a half-dozen restaurants now. Also, several $100 million worth of commercial real estate, all starting with the hot dog stand. Joe dropped his silverware and stared at Pender, who continued savoring his lunch. He's the guy we came here to meet. The real estate magnate, is he? Ernesto was headed back toward their tables as Pender whispered to Joe. A very useful thing to remember. Appearances can be deceiving. He slid over to make room for the chef. Truth is, they nearly always are. Ernesto slipped into the booth next to Pender. Over the next 5 minutes, he and Pender gave Joe a quick history of his career. Young Ernesto's Lafreight's reputation had grown until he was discovered by several business executives who abandoned the local high-class establishments to have their power lunches at the little sidewalk hot dog stand. Although Ernesto rarely talked about himself, one of these regulars, a man whom Ernesto called simply the Connector, Joe made a mental note to ask Pender later about this mysterious-sounding character. Eventually, learned of his background as a chef. Impressed with the young man's sharp business mind and exceptional devotion to service, a few of the executives pulled together an investment group and backed him with the finances to open his own restaurant. And within a few years, Pender interjected his little cafe, did so well that he bought us out, earning us all a tidy profit in the process. And he hadn't stopped there. After establishing a group of area restaurants, Ernesto began investing some of his profits in the properties adjoining his restaurants. Over the years, he became one of the largest commercial real estate owners in the city. As he listened, Joe realized there was another layer to Ernesto that he hadn't seen at first. Underneath that jovial, bigger-than-life Italian chef person, there was a powerful sense of focus and intention. Once Joe became aware of it, it was riveting. He began to see why the little group of executives had invested in the man's future. Joe understood that Pender had emphasized the word experience for a reason. It was not the hot dogs, but the person serving the hot dogs that had vaulted the young man to such popularity. Not the dining experience. Ernesto had made buying a hot dog into an unforgettable event, especially for children, Pender pointed out. I've always been good at remembering kids' names, Ernesto explained, and remembering their birthdays, continued Pender, and their favorite colors, their favorite cartoon heroes, and their best friends' names. He glanced at Joe and gave the next words emphasis, etc. Ernesto gave another trademark shrug. What can I say? I like kids. Children started dragging their parents to the little hot dog stand. Soon their parents were dragging their friends there too. It turned out that Ernesto was just as gifted at remembering adults' interests as he was with his kids. Everyone likes to be appreciated, said Ernesto. And that's the golden rule of business, added Pender. All things be equal. Ernesto finished the phrase. People will do business with and refer business to those people they know, like, and trust. He turned to look at Joe. Tell me what distinguishes a good restaurant from a great restaurant. Why do some restaurants do well, while a few, like this one, do stratospherically well? Obviously, better food, replied Joe with no hesitation. Ernesto's delighted laughter filled the booth. Several heads turned, and a wave of smiles rolling through the dining room like ripples on a pond. Ah, Miligrazé, Sigmor, you are the man of good taste. But I have to admit, while our food is very good, there are half a dozen other places within 3 blocks with food just as wonderful as ours. Still, even on their best nights, they're lucky to have half the clientele that comes here. Why is that, do you think? Joe had no answer. A bad restaurant, Ernesto went on, tries to give just enough food and service, both in quantity and quality, just to justify to the money it makes from the customer. A good restaurant strives to give the most quantity and quality for the money it takes. But a great restaurant strives to defy imagination. Its goal is to provide a higher quality of food and service than any amount of money could possibly pay for. He looked at Pender, then back at Joe. Did the old man tell you he would show you his 5 laws? Joe nodded eagerly. He was about to learn the first law of stratospheric success. Ernesto looked again at Pender. Should I tell him? Please, replied Pender. Ernesto leaned in and spoke in a conspiratorial whisper. Your true worth is determined by how much more you give in value than you take in payment. Joe wasn't sure how to respond. Giving away more value than you get paid for. That was their big secret? I'm sorry, I don't get it, Joe confessed. I mean, I appreciate where you're coming from, and your story is obviously, well, it's amazing, but honestly, that sounds like a recipe for bankruptcy. It's almost like you're trying to avoid making money. Not at all, Ernesto waggled one finger. Does it make money? Is it not a bad question? It's a great question. It's just a bad first question. It starts you off pointed in the wrong direction. He let Joe ponder that for a moment, then continued. The first question should be, does it serve? Does it add value to others? If the answer to that question is yes, then you can go ahead and ask, does it make money? In other words, said Joe, exceed people's expectations and they'll pay you even more. That's one way to look at it, replied Ernesto. But the point isn't to have them pay you more. It's to give them more. You give. Why? Another shrug. Because you love to. It's not a strategy. It's a way of life. And when you do, he added with a big grin, then very, very profitable things begin to happen. Wait, said Joe. So profitable things begin to happen. But I thought you said you're not thinking about the results. That's right, Ernesto agreed. You're not. But that doesn't mean they won't happen. And they certainly will, added Pender. All the great fortunes in the world have been created by men and women who had a greater passion for what they were giving, their product, service, or idea, than for what they were getting. And many of those great fortunes have been squandered by others who had a greater passion for what they were getting than what they were giving. Joe grappled with everything he'd heard. It seemed to make sense, at least when these two characters were saying it. But as far as he could see, it just didn't square with his experience. I have a hard time seeing how, said Pender, holding up his index finger and cutting Joe off mid-sentence. Joe blanched. What? Ernesto grinned. He leaned in toward Joe and said, did he tell you about his, condition? Joe looked puzzled for a moment, and then he understood. Oh, right, the condition. Pender smiled. It's not about seeing, it's about doing. Joe sighed. Right, he repeated. I need to find some way to apply it. He looked at both men, then added, or I'll turn into a pumpkin. The two men shuffled with glee, and Joe felt his face relax into a grin, too. For the moment, he had forgotten all about his secret quest for clout and leverage. Pender was already on his feet. We should go. This young man needs to get back to work. Who are you seeing tomorrow? Ernesto asked Joe. Joe looked at Pender. Tomorrow, a bona fide genius, replied Pender. The CEO. Ah, said Ernesto, nodding. The CEO. Very good, very good. Keep your ears open, young man. The CEO? Joe tried to imagine who this person might be.